You're listening to Merykid Explains, an oral history of one artist's discography featuring facts, feelings, and most importantly, context. Now maybe you stumbled here by accident, or perhaps you're listening on some faraway planet, in some distant time, vibing off an ancient method of communication. Or maybe, just maybe, you're one of the dozens of die-hard Merykid fans that actually finds value in this content. Regardless, feel free to sit back, get comfortable, and listen along to the gentle ramblings of a man and his memories. This is Merykid Explains. To set the tone for this record, it's 2010. Most music has gone electronic. I have released several folk albums that have progressively become more and more experimental to the point of psychedelic. And one would assume that as I am about to release my first official full-length album, it would be a concentrated effort in the genre of music that I had not only been working on for the better part of 10 years, but needless to say, it would be something that made sense from both an artistic and maybe professional standpoint, which is why I decided to scrap all of that and make a 30-minute avant-garde, fully electronic record based on a very loose concept about a man who goes to space, and each song on the record covers the 24 hours before he leaves in the spaceship. The album was called The Raccoon, and in the story, the name of the spaceship is the Raccoon, which we find out in the very last song. And it included spoken word, it included vocal speeches and skits, different languages. It had a drum machine that I had purchased on Craigslist called, I don't even remember what it was called, but it was endorsed by the rap production group called the Studio Kangs, and that's K-A-N-G-Z, Studio Kangs. If you want to look up that specific drum machine, it had electric guitars, it had full band. Brandon Guerra came back to play drums on the whole thing. It was one big, wonderful experiment, and we'll discuss how that was taken at the end of this episode. But to set the scene again and just to sort of recap on what I've covered in the previous 4 episodes of this series. By 2010, I had concentrated all of my efforts into becoming what would be known as a champion of San Antonio's music scene. I had recently overcome a pretty serious illness, and this was because of like a very experimental medication, which the doctors had sort of been throwing, darts at the wall for years at this point to see what works, and by golly, one of them did. And so suddenly in around early 2010, I was in a place where I had a lot of time to spend working on music, because under my doctor's orders, I was supposed to just exist. I was supposed to let my body heal from the things that I had been dealing with for the last several years. And so here I was with my own radio show and several albums, several years worth of work that had sort of created a bit of clout. I had a pretty nice rehearsal space. I had amassed a pretty decent fan base, at least a group of people that would come to shows. And I was going to go all in on what was to become my full-length record. Now, where did the idea of the Raccoon come from? Well, let me again bring up a name that we heard in the last episode. So my good friend and at the time manager, Brandon McCormick, he had recently introduced me to a little-known show called The Twilight Zone. And again, this is in 2010. I believe it was actually the annual New Year's marathon that they do on cable television. He told me about the Twilight Zone. He said it was something that he felt like I would be into. And by golly, he was right. I took to that show so hard and so heavy. And really all I could think about was the concept as a writer where there were just no rules. In every episode of The Twilight Zone, which lasted, anywhere from 20 to 30 minutes, you had this absolute bonkers premise where, it starts on a distant planet somewhere and the astronauts just happen to be there and suddenly the robots show up and suddenly, fill in the blanks. Twilight Zone at this point is an American staple in television, and Rod Serling is considered a genius. And I was just sort of ripe for that type of inspiration to completely take hold of me, and it just became my favorite thing in the world. And on top of that, at the time, I also previously mentioned in a previous episode that Alan Palomo with Neon Indian, as well as several other notable indie kind of like internet acts, were just sort of changing the landscape from what was, a kind of Arcade Fire / Phoenix indie sphere to becoming entirely based on dance music that was mostly just written on your computer in a bedroom. It had the whole vibe had sort of changed, and it was very heavy on electronic music. Notably so, a big shift at the time was actually coming from the legendary folk artist Sufjan Stevens put out the album Age of Odds, which was an entirely huge departure from his sort of States albums project, where he was making like really strict folk records about every state. He got to, he did Michigan, and then he did Illinois, and then he did Illinois Part 2, which were just outtakes from Illinois. And then he did Age of Odds. He didn't even, he either got bored of it or he realized that it was way too much of a project for him to overtake. But all of this was happening at the same time. It was a shift in the culture, and I was aware of it, and I just wanted to kind of jump in. Other things that were happening at the same time. Drake had just released his mixtape, So Far Gone, and that had changed music considerably. This sort of like singing over experimental / indie hip hop beats, and he was singing with auto-tune, and he was rapping, and he was rapping over Like Lee samples or things of that nature, where there were just blurred lines everywhere. There were no rules anymore. And so the lack of rules in music, alongside my new inspiration from the lack of rules in writing for The Twilight Zone, all of it just sort of amassed into this giant project that I took on, which for the first time in many years, I was no longer writing music that was intended to be successful or intended to meet a certain audience. It just started from ground zero, from a place of pure inspiration. And I'm going to sort of walk through the album and kind of give as much background and context as possible for each of these tracks, and then I'll sort of give more thoughts at the end after that's done. The record starts with From Down Here, and that is the first introduction to the sort of like group of kids that I was hanging out with at Trinity University, because remember, I had the radio show. Brandon, my manager, was at Trinity, and so through all of these doors opening at the university, I was really utilizing everything I could from a resource perspective. And so this was a bunch of like the art students at Trinity that I was sort of, bumming around with. And it starts with, funny enough, it starts with a girl named Caitlin and she was an acting major at Trinity, and so I asked her to be a part of this in order to do this kind of spoken word skit thing. And then comes in Brandon is sort of playing the role of, I guess, the main character, Brandon, my manager. Brandon famously, and this has not changed over the last 12 years, Brandon absolutely hates his performance on this record. He will be the first person to say that. In fact, I just texted him about this specific project of sort of revisiting the records, and all he said back to me was, I really can't stand my performance in the first track. And I mean, I promised him that I would bring that up because I want to give respect to, like, recognizing with Brandon that he does not love his performance on it. I happen to love it a lot. I've listened to it a lot, and I think that I don't even know what it is anymore. I've heard it so much. It's just something that exists. It is a part of the record. Another cool thing about this track is that, like, I'm in it. You can hear me say something like, "Hey, watch it." There are just a bunch of other people too that are sort of doing, it's a very unique collage of sound trying to create the setting of a train. Because again, the story starts with our hero, quote unquote, getting on a train to leave his town, to leave towards the site of the rocket ship, which he is then going to get in and then leave space. So the album starts from the very beginning. He's at the train station. His love, his woman, is begging him not to go, and he can't be bothered with these trivial pursuits of humanity anymore. And so he gets on the train. We hear the conductor, again played by my friend Chris Madden, who was the singer of the Blowing Trees and just always constantly in sort of like in the same circles of people that I was working with on this record. And from Down Here ends. Don't Say You'll Wait For Me is just a quick interlude, just to sort of introduce the drum machine. I'm always a huge fan. I had just gotten like a cracked version of Ableton. It was Ableton 8 by my friend Roy. And so for me, I was sampling a lot and making a lot of things in my spare time, and I always appreciated moments where the producers would let the drums play out because I think they knew that they were doing it so that they could be chopped and sampled by somebody else. And so for me, this was actually an homage to producers and sort of people like me who are always looking for drums to sample. And so Don't Say You'll Wait For Me is simply, I don't know, let me see here, 18 seconds of a drum machine, and there's an 808 in there and all kinds of things. So that, if you're out there and you're looking for drums, go ahead and take that. You're welcome. And then track number 3, Thoughts to Sound. This is actually the first actual music that comes in the record. And Thoughts to Sound, I'll tell you what I most remembered about this. And this is another kind of this record and this song specifically, I think, are sort of like relics of their time. Because again, I was not working with I wasn't in like a high powered studio. I was really doing like home studio type stuff. Again, this project was being produced by Jaime, who had done Boy and the Bird. And then, not even kidding, halfway through the record, he just quit. He was like, I can't do it anymore. I've got something else that I need to work on. And he passed the project over to Jared, who had done The Magic Attic. And so halfway through the recording of this project, it just shifted everything from one location and one producer into another studio and another producer, both of them at houses. At homes, but it just became a whole different energy. And so what we ended up tracking with Jaime was a lot of the basic instruments, like Thoughts to Sound, I think, was mostly Jaime. I remember tracking the bass in his kitchen. I think my friend and the ex-guitar player of Window, Jimmy Dasher, tracked the electric guitars on this whole record. So he was in there too. That's a fun fact. Jimmy and I had not worked together since I left Window, so it had been at least 3 or 4 years. So he was on the electric guitar. I was playing the bass. I was playing the Casio Tone 403. The Casio Tone 403 and drum machine combo are the kind of like foundational backbone of each of the musical tracks on this album. It's a very unique combination, and it was like as close as my uneducated musical mind could get to trying to do something similar to like whatever Neon Indian and Washed Out and all the other cooler bands were doing. So if you listen to Thoughts to Sound, that's my honest to God attempt at trying to like recreate the same type of electronic music. It was so far in the opposite direction. It's so funny. But anyway, so Thoughts to Sound again. You've got in the context of the story now, the main character. These are the thoughts in his head that he's sort of like using to justify why he's leaving Earth, or at least like his city, right? And it's him sort of judging the world around him as one needs to do in order to justify making such a drastic and dramatic act as to leave, right? So it's him sort of looking down upon society, saying like, just sort of the concept of Thoughts to Sound. It's like, you think you have control because you put your thoughts to sound, but when it sinks even deeper, you'll recognize that I will never follow you down. Yeah, very judgmental, very, very holier than thou and dismissive of society, right? Social media had not even gotten to the point, even close to where it is now. Instagram still didn't even exist. And so I think this was based entirely off of just what it was like to live in a world with everybody on Facebook. Everybody just posting, maybe Twitter too, everybody just posting their thoughts all the time. So the one great takeaway that I do recall asking Jaime to try to accomplish and achieve from a production standpoint on this track specifically is I said, I want a wall of sound on guitar to sound like Linkin Park Meteora. And for better or worse, I felt like this was going to sort of like create a genre that I had not really heard before. It was going to just mix pop rock, and by pop rock, I didn't mean anything other than literally I was talking about something like Linkin Park. Really high fidelity guitar. And I wanted it to be very present, and I wanted it to sound like it was you were being slapped with the guitar. And we did not achieve that at all. When I listen back to the Jaime was such a sort of like his powers were the sort of like subtle ways that he wove music in and out of itself. You know, again, I mentioned that he had a much more sort of like softer, quieter, kind of Radiohead-esque aesthetic to his production, and I was over here being like, no man, we're gonna make a Linkin Park record. And so it probably very well led to the reason that he just sort of quit the process of producing this record like halfway through. But regardless, we didn't quite get the sound I was hoping for on this record, and that kind of comes through in a lot of it. We did get a very unique sound out of this record that I've never really heard before or since, for better or worse, mostly for worse. But the other things too, you know, the drums too, lacking a little bit, and this one might actually be the worst culprit in regard to the production of the drums. They come in very flat, and the guitar comes in very flat, and so Thoughts to Sound may very well be the biggest reason that most people couldn't get into this record is because this is the first one that came in musically, and then I think that it fell flat production-wise almost immediately. And it kills me because everything else after this is so fucking cool and good and unique, and the mixes are cool, and the drums are sitting better, but it's like this song, and you know, first impressions are everything, and this was the first impression of the record for a lot of people, and I know that people were getting right up to that point and then just kind of like, nope, not for me. So Thoughts to Sound, in my opinion, is really cool, especially because at the very end, Jimmy, we tracked like, I don't know, 6 different guitar solos, and we have them playing at the same time. I'm playing the bass, arguably, in my opinion, the best bass that I've ever played or written. It's just very funky. It's very It's very in the groove. And again, Brandon Guerra, just a wild drummer. This man is just going in on what he's bringing to the table. So not all of the production quality is there, but the idea, and once you really get to the end of Thoughts to Sound, this record really takes shape. And for me, it was hard because I wished it had a little bit nicer and smoother of an entry point. But I guess for the real fans, if you just got through the first like 4 minutes of the song's 4 minutes and 5 seconds. If you got through the first like 3.5 minutes of this song, you were in for something really special. So, Thoughts to Sound, sort of the key to unlock this record. You just had to get through this one. And if you're listening to this and you're going to now listen to the Raccoon, push through Thoughts to Sound. I promise it gets better and more interesting. So, track 4, Going. In my head, remember, just to follow along the story of this kind of epic concept. In Going, the train, imagine you're just seeing a shot of the train kind of crossing the countryside, and you're hearing a radio station changing, and the folky guitar, I'm playing the main riff, Jimmy is soloing off of it. It's a really cool little groove. Jimmy and I could really lock in. I mean, like, if there are people that heard the band Window. He and I were the core of it. We started the band together, and when we were on, we were on. It was always great to play with Jimmy. He could arguably be one of my musical soulmates just because, no matter what I brought to the table, he's just one of those guys that made it better. So Going is a very quick, short little interlude. I just wanted to, as I often do, make sure that folk music got included somewhere in what I was doing. I was never going to walk away from it, but, it got what it got. Track 5, Two Wrongs. Two Wrongs was the first single from this record, and it was, in my opinion, this song was ahead of its time. You've got, I'm singing in auto-tune, it's a drum machine loop, then here comes the synth vintage keyboard, then here comes this, like, right after the, a minute into it, like, here comes the full band with the sort of, it just turns into this kind of like surf, rock, auto-tune, electro jam about being in a nightclub and, hooking up with the wrong person. Again, this is the night before, this is halfway through the record, the night before he leaves town. Our main character has sort of gone out to distract himself in whatever city he's in. And he's in this nightclub, and there's a girl that he's around, and there's the line in the bridge specifically that I really like a lot, and I think it really ties together the sort of vibe of everything, where she says, it started when she asked me what we're drinking, and now she wants to know when we're leaving, as if I were ever even here at all. And I from a lyrical standpoint, and as the person that wrote it, but also 12 years later, looking back on it with a sort of fresh take on it, I love that line. It really sort of brings together the just distanced emotional state of this kind of like vampire-esque, and then you have the auto-tune also, which adds even more of a sort of barrier in between like the main character and whoever he's interacting with, and we know that he's already planning on leaving the world, and so it just was something that I feel really captured exactly what I wanted to capture with that song. And that's not always easy to do, especially again considering I was really trying to make like an episode of The Twilight Zone with this whole project. Again, Jimmy Dasher on electric guitar, Brandon on drums, me on bass, me on keyboard, me writing the drum machine, and I'm the one singing. So, and now next, track 6, In Dreams. I would actually consider this, one of the highlights of the record, if not the highlight, alongside what I believe are several other highlights. The second half of this record, in my opinion, is some of the most far out, artistic stuff I've ever been able to make or create. I mean, it really is the farthest that I could possibly take my creativity and ability at this point in my life. So In Dreams starts with a Spanish spoken word by an artist named Rachel Brownlee is what she went by at the time. She's married now. I'm not quite sure what her last name is. But Rachel Brownlee, who was also she created the artwork for the cover of the Raccoon, which I, in my world, that's a very iconic image. And she made the cover, and she also spoke the Spanish in this track. And we had her, and then we had a bunch of other, again, we had the sort of like peanut gallery of Brandon McCormick's Trinity University friends who I got to show up to. This was at this point we were recording at Jared's house, and they showed up and imagine the direction of me just being like, okay, laugh and just keep fucking laughing and you'll laugh until I tell you to stop. I said it much nicer, but that was essentially what that was. If you go into the song, I mean, it really kind of devolves into sort of like Pink Floyd-esque psychedelic laughter. And the keyboard line, again, playing it on the Casio Tone 403, I almost feel like it has a kind of like Gorillaz vibe to it. And the drum machine too. I'm really down with this little drum beat that I made. All in all, just stoked for this track. This is one of the ones that I'm really proud of. I think this is just one of those times where I made something that maybe it's never been done anywhere else. A couple of times on the Raccoon, and In Dreams specifically, I think I was able to make noise that has never been made before or since. And as I explained earlier in this series, I'm constantly chasing as an artist that Natalie Portman in Garden State moment where she says, I know that in this moment when I dance like this in this spot, it's the only time it's ever been done before. And so that was always in the back of my mind, trying to think like, how can I make a thing, if it's good or if it's bad, whatever, that's subjective. But arguably, this noise has never been made before. And I think In Dreams kind of got there. I would be willing to I'd put money on that at this time and place, around 2010, no one else was simply making music that sounded like this. And if they were, I would love to hear it. Please find a way to send it to me. I would do anything to listen, and I want to meet that person, and I want us to talk about our creative process. So from In Dreams, here we go into Astronaut. Astronaut is the absolute climax of this record. We're talking about, 5.5 minutes long. This is the song and the part of the story where he arrives at the scene of the spaceship and the crowds have gathered. And it's really interesting because even in 2010, it was just understood that everything in the world was overly politicized to the point where you were either highly conservative or highly liberal, and there was just no in between. And so even in this song, I'm describing having to walk through a sea of people who are on either side of the issue, right? My proudest moment as a lyricist and as a writer ever takes place in this song because I used the word pseudo-patriotic. 6 syllables, 1 word. Anybody else bring in 6-syllable words? Give me Talib. Give me Mos Def. Give me Busta. Tell me who else is bringing 6-syllable words to the table as a lyricist. All right? Merykid. That's who. One time he did it. This song, Astronaut, in the Raccoon. 6 mother effing syllables. Pseudo-patriotic. What? I'm so proud of that. Anyway, so the very short story of just like walking a few feet from the landing site up to the ladder, and I think there's a really cool moment where, you know, he's just sort of stoically walking, and he's being yelled at. There were T-shirts being sold, and you know, describing any sort of scene you would imagine where news stations are profiting off of like this event, and so there's like merch being sold, and there's cameras, and everybody has an opinion, and he's just sort of walking through it, and then he gets to the ladder, he climbs up, and right before he has that pivotal moment where he just sort of like looks back at the crowd, and then he tells them what's on his mind, and he says, "I've seen planes falling from the sky, and I've seen cell phone videos of people dying, and I've seen pictures from space following the smoke, so please don't blame me when I go." And as I write this, it was only a few days ago that the Uvalde school shooting took place in 2022. I mean, I'm talking like a couple days ago. We're still in the aftermath of it. And so even 12 years ago, when I wrote, "I've seen cell phone videos of people dying," it just kind of goes to show you that I don't know if things are getting better. I mean, shit, it's more than 10 years later after I wrote that lyric, and it's still fucking happening. I don't know if things are getting better. If anything, this could be proof that it's just not. Like things somehow just stopped progressing in society, or maybe it's just one of. I hate to think that massive school shootings or the way that we're documenting that type of stuff is just a normal part of society, and this kind of supersedes our sort of instant gratification of getting upset every time it happens. I wish I had deeper words to say about it. I wish I was a smarter or more philosophical person and could sort of like give a better maybe like message to what I'm trying to get across. But for better or worse, for whatever it is, 12 years ago I wrote that lyric, and if I were to write a song today, I could write it again and it would still be relevant. And that's kind of scary. Kind of sucks. And it's not, I don't know, man. I mean, the whole point of this story of the raccoon is that it's just one guy who doesn't feel like he belongs in society anymore. I think a lot of us feel that way, especially in 2022, especially with the things that we've gone through in the last, multiple recessions, a worldwide pandemic. Go down the list. I mean, it can't be. I know that I wasn't alone in the way that I was thinking about and writing about my psyche, just sort of like trying to disconnect from the like post 9/11 world that has just gotten more and more chaotic and more divided. And so in this moment that he's climbing the steps to the rocket ship and he turns back and he addresses the crowd, he's like, "Don't blame me for this. I don't even know why I'm doing this, but I think you can understand if you really give it a chance." And the chorus, "So what if I never come back down?" It's another kind of, I get it. I'm 37 now, and I have a lot more in my life that I'm willing to like fight for and stick around for. But at 24 years old, in 2010, we were sort of still in the recession from 2008. We were already maybe like 5 or so years into Facebook being a thing, and so it had just kind of taken over. Normalcy was just starting to all shift towards social media. There were just a lot of changes happening. I don't know how many of them were for the better, and there was a lot of escapism. That's what this record was in a way. It was me, and let me also say this. At the same time, as a person, I was dealing with a ton of health issues. And as an artist, I was dealing with a city that simply did not care about the work I was doing to try and champion that city. Like I said, I was pretty fresh off of getting like a review or a press release from like one of my previous albums that was them, just kind of laughing at me in a way. And I just felt so removed from everything. And I was trying to work it all out, and it came out as this album. And so that's, at the core of it, the Raccoon is a sort of voice to my removed sense of self. And I really like the ending of the song. It kind of goes into this really sort of dark sound, which is supposed to imply that the sort of fire is coming out of the rocket, and you know, it ends on the words, "I'm drifting away, I'm drifting away." Is he talking mentally, or is he talking physically in a rocket ship? You know, that's kind of up to the listener to decide. But I look back on it, and I'm really proud of it. I'm really proud of this piece of work. Astronaut, in my opinion, is another one of those songs where I would put this up as one of the strongest and most well-written things I've ever done as an artist. I think it's cool to be able to look at your work and say, like, this one was clearly, like, the message was really, like, hitting. And then underneath all of it, the instrumentation, which, again, the drum machine, which I'm writing on, the Casio tone, which I'm writing on, the keyboard. Jimmy Dasher is playing the electric guitar, and then you've got Brandon Guerra just absolutely going to town on the snare drum. I mean, his, like, the attack of his drumming just really sets the tone underneath everything. There's a lot of tension. It's very uneasy. It's rushed and slow at the same time. I think the drums, and I tell him this, I've told him this a few times, but, like, the drumming on this track is the most important element to me. And I think it's almost like the way that we know what John Frusciante's or John Mayer's guitar sounds like. It's like that's what Brandon's snare drum sounds like in this track to me. That's just, like, so undeniably Brandon Guerra playing the snare drum. And so Astronaut, just like that 6-minute epic declaration of fuck you, Earth, I'm leaving. The next one, See You Raccoon. This was an homage to the other love of my life in the sci-fi world, which was Cowboy Bebop. Again, another just, like, element of entertainment where when you watch it, completely contained within one season, in my opinion and most opinions, the best anime ever written. Maybe one of even the best shows ever written. I am, of course, talking about the animated series, not necessarily the Netflix series, which was cool, but, you know, not the same, and maybe a little unnecessary. But See You Raccoon is just a real quick kind of countdown to imply that outside the rocket ship, we're all experiencing, or the audience or the crowd is experiencing, the countdown to where the rocket takes off. Whatever you are, whatever I'm not. This song is one of my favorite songs I've ever written. It's so sweet. It's so catchy. It's so easy to like. A local singer from San Antonio. Her name is Cheska. That's what she goes by, Cheska. She's the one singing the female part, and I just love how our voices sound together. This one I really like a lot. I remember tracking this one. This one we tracked with Jaime. There's not much more to say about it. I mean, like, I listened to this one a lot. I think it's got a very sort of nice kind of hip-hop beat to it, and then in comes the Casio tone, and in comes the drumming. This is another one of Brandon's drum beats that is really just, like, off the rails, and I think adds this really cool element of chaos and power to what is otherwise, like, a kind of, like, pretty chill, laid-back beat. And I would have to imagine at this point I'm pretty heavily inspired to this record. Maybe because the production quality just isn't all the way there, but I can and I will stand by the fact that I don't think anything else sounds like the Raccoon. Anything. It's completely a thing that could be made at any time, and nobody could say that's definitely made at that. Oh, this was that era. This was that era. No, it stands completely on its own because of the players, because of the instruments, and because of like my inspiration and just really what I was going through. But whatever you are, whatever I'm not, sweet song. I really love Jimmy's playing. We decided at some point just play one note, and that one note on the guitar, in my opinion, that comes in the choruses, is so fucking powerful. I don't know how to explain it. Just playing one note, in my opinion, changed the whole song, and there's something very. It was very right. It was the right move for sure. Instrumentally, I'm really in love with this track, and it just sort of as it comes, it fades out in the story. This is track 9, so we're getting near the end of everything, and so at this point, the rocket has taken off. And we now are just sort of left wondering, like, okay, well, what happens next? And that's where we get to the final track, From Up Here. Now, From Up Here is heavily a departure from everything else on this record, and it comes right back to my folk roots. I kind of got to this point, and there will be other future episodes where I discuss this too. It kind of became the thing where I would always close an album with a straight up folk song. I don't know why. It started with Addicted and Boy and the Bird, and then I do it here with From Up Here, which is the bookend. Obviously, the record starts with From Down Here, and then the album ends with From Up Here, which now, in the context of the story, the rocket is in space. And at this point, I would have to imagine I was pretty heavily inspired by Bon Iver. They had just put out their first record, or maybe re-released it for Emma forever ago, and so that was pretty heavy on kind of like where folk music was going, and it was also where I happened to lean into. I played all the instruments on this track. In the beginning, there's the there's the acoustic guitar, there's the singing, and then all the voices are me, and there's the snare drum, which is also me. I remember tracking the snare drum in Jaime's garage. And then at the end, this was really cool. We brought in a bunch of musicians to do that sort of orchestral outro, which we had a girl named Rachel playing the cello. We had a guy named Darren playing the cello. These were friends of Ryan Guerra. They were all in the orchestra together in high school or college, UTSA or something. And then we had a young Maurice, is what they go by, Maurice, on the violin and saxophone. Maurice at this point is very heavily involved in the works with Claire Rousey and other sort of ambient Austin acts, but back in those days they were just bumming around San Antonio, and I got them to come in, and they also attended Trinity University, so just sort of in that collective group they stopped by, and we worked out a little piece, and so really inspired saxophone playing at the end. And I'm also playing trombone, not well, but playing it as much as I can. I played trombone in the middle school choir. I think I mentioned that, or the middle school choir, the middle school band. I mentioned that in a previous episode. And so every now and then I would just bring it out in order to, if you needed one note to be played for an extended period of time, I could figure it out. I knew the mouth formation. So I'm playing brass on this one too, and it has a very just unique, sweet outro that just kind of fades out. And the story, from a lyrical standpoint, it's really me unpacking a lot of what I had been going through personally, up to the point where I had gotten to this place. I stood on the Western Shore when I was 22, stared into the ocean and knew that I was alone, but things would be changing soon, so I waited. And that was an homage to the last tour that I was on in Window when I was 22 years old. When we got to California, the band we had the showcase for Atlantic Records, and the record label actually told them and suggested to them after the showcase to lose me, the singer, the guy that wrote all the songs. And they were like, if you get a new singer, maybe we'll work with you. And it was only brought to my attention when they told me, we thought about it, but we decided not to do that. And my response was like, that's cool, I quit. And I don't blame them. I mean, at that point, we had been traveling and touring for years, and we were making no money. We were young. I know that there were just choices that had to be made, and it's hard to say no when you've been working towards something and suddenly it's being given to you, but with the caveat of, lose the guy that brought you here. And so during that trip, there was a time where they had been offered that by the record label. And I do want to stand by the fact that this was 2007. Record labels were in complete free fall. They had no idea what the fuck they were doing. They were making only wrong choices. And so, in my opinion, that was par for the course for someone at a record label to say something along those lines. But here nor there. There were a few days after we had that show in Los Angeles, and the record label had propositioned the band to get rid of me. But before they told me about it, they were just acting so fucking weird. If you can imagine how uncomfortable it is for them to be considering what they were considering and having to talk it over. And we're all sleeping in the same car. And so I think naturally they just sort of started to distance themselves from me while they were making this choice. And this would be while we were like, eating lunch. And I would just be sort of like, they would all just be sitting away from me, or they would all be suddenly walking together, and I would just be like way behind them. And, there were these little things that everything was so weird. And we were all so young and nobody knew how to communicate effectively. So I just recall standing on the beach when we were all kind of taking a moment. And I remember thinking like, this has got to change. I don't like this. I don't like how this feels. I felt very alone. And so that was the end, really, of me being in that band. And I talk about that in the song. And then, so I stood on the ocean at 22, stood on the Western Shore when I was 22, stared into the ocean and knew that I was alone, but things would be changing soon, so I waited. Stood on the Western Shore when I was 23, took a flower I found, threw it into the sea, flew to a place just out of my reach, fell to the water and started to sink. For a moment, my eyes followed the place that the flower did climb, and it stopped on the moon. And so that was me just sort of giving. Oh, and then the rest of the lyric is at 20. That was at 23, and then at 24, I built a rocket ship and I called it the Raccoon. 24, I was that age when I was writing this record, right? So all of that is just in my very sort of loose way of putting together this concept, of writing this story, of presenting the idea of this guy decides to leave Earth, and he does, because that's what happens in sci-fi. There are no rules. They can kind of do whatever they want. That was me just giving all of the context to whatever questions should arise throughout the story. It was just, I threw a flower into the ocean and I looked at the moon suddenly, and then that was all I needed. And now I'm building a rocket ship, and I called it the Raccoon. You're not supposed to know what the Raccoon is until that moment, so it's like a big reveal. For anybody that could possibly care or be invested, that was the reveal, that the Raccoon was the ship. And I do remember Brandon McCormick again. He and I were sitting and talking about it, and I remember telling him, does it end with we know that the ship comes back, or like, do we know that, how does it end? And I think he was actually the one that was just like, we shouldn't know. It just sort of, it ends at the beginning of the journey into space. And so that was how I chose how it ended, where it's just the very last words are goodbye. And in my mind, so now that the album, and that was the end of the record, and it ends with the word goodbye, and then like a big, giant horn section, just sort of like wailing one last note, which then, if you were to let the record play again, kind of goes right into the train station of the next, of the first track. The problems that I feel like I had executing this record, I was very young. This was my first concept record ever. To me, it was like this would be the soundtrack to a Broadway musical, but there's no lines in between. So if you just listen to the music, you really don't have any idea what's kind of going on. You're just listening to maybe the songs, or the strength of the songs, how they were written is hopefully enjoyable enough. But it's missing a lot. That's what this record really is. It's basically like the songs are pushing the narrative forward, which would make a lot of sense if there was narrative, which there is not. There is nothing to explain to anyone what's happening besides what's in my own brain, unfortunately. And in my mind, it made total sense because I knew what the spirit of the record was about. But I understand that I did not give anyone any context about the point or where this album was supposed to take you. And so, 12 years later, I just sort of have this really cool, really weird album that makes absolutely no sense in the course of my career. 0 sense. It's a whole different person. It's a whole different artist that put out the Raccoon than the person that people had followed and invested in for the previous, 5 years, 6 years at that point throughout the course of my musical career. I can't apologize for it. I cannot. I'm unapologetic. It was me being inspired. It was me having to make this art at the time, which I can only hope as a creative to be so inspired like that again in my lifetime. And I have. But there was something very pure about the need to create the Raccoon. It just didn't come with any notice. And so if you want to talk about not understanding how to get the city of San Antonio behind me before this, when this album came out, I just lost them completely. Nobody had any idea what the hell I was doing. Even my own friends were like, really, and in their very kind, loving way, were very confused about where I was going as an artist, and rightfully so, looking back on it. The other thing that is of note in this record is that Brandon Guerra at this time, you remember we met him when he was about 17, and that was a couple albums ago. And so at this point, Brandon has graduated high school and is about to go on tour with like a national drum line. Like, this guy is just about to begin the journey of his life, which is going full in as a drummer. And one of the last things that I ever did up in the Magic Attic was we brought Brandon in, and he tracked all of the drums to a sort of demo tracks. He tracked all the drums in one day, in one session. Jaime actually produced, Jaime captured the drums, and so Brandon came in, tracked all the drums And then he left, and then he and I did not see each other or speak to each other again for 11 years. Only 11 years later did suddenly he and I find ourselves back in the same city, both looking to do music, and that's how we came to the record called Death Bloom, and that's a whole other thing, which, you know, we'll get to. But when Brandon walked out of that session with the last piece of his drums and, you know, said goodbye and was like, I'm going on tour tomorrow, he and I did not speak again or see each other again. Maybe in passing. I actually remember in passing one time in Austin at a concert. I was filming the concert. He was playing. And we just sort of like casually were like, hey, cool, what's up? But with that, aside from that one point, Brandon, Guerra, and I did not see each other again or speak again for about 11 years, which, you know, such is life, man. But other than that, the takeaway from the process of the Raccoon is that it really cemented me as being able to do anything. It gave me a lot of freedom to take. At this point, I was at a crossroads where I could essentially do whatever I wanted. If the point of me stepping away from folk music was to step out of the box, I had essentially set the box on fire and then just sort of kicked it down the road. There was no more box after the Raccoon. But the problem was that people now had no idea what I was doing. There was nothing to hold on to. And in a lot of ways, I was the strongest I had ever been as an artist and the farthest I had ever been from being a San Antonio artist. And I had to now make a choice, and this is the crossroads of one of the great crossroads of my life was in this pivotal moment where I had to make a choice. What do I want? How do I get there? And what is it going to cost me to get the support of San Antonio? And that took us magically all the way back to the year of 1985.